So initially we begin by taking a look at the relationship. So we all know that the two are interrelated. Okay, and also we have three views here. First, view of Ross, then Fitch's view, and Spencer's view. So the first one, James Ross says that philosophy and education are two sides of the same coin. That means they are dependent on each other. You cannot have one without the other. So the first one, that is philosophy, is contemplative, whereas education is the active side. So in other words, we see that philosophy will help us to come up with various theories, will help us to come up with innovative ideas, innovative solutions, and on the other hand, we see that education is the one that will help us to put these theoretical things into practice. And in this way, we see that only when these two complement each other can learning be effective, can learning be tailor-made for any particular system or any particular context. Then Fichte also said that the art of education will never attain complete clearness without philosophy. So once again, underlining the fact of the importance of philosophy, whether it be methods or it be philosophical thinking in education. It is only when we philosophize, when we think critically, can true learning take place. And finally, we take a look at Herbert Spencer's views. He says that true education is practicable to true philosophers. So here we see that Spencer believed that education should be grounded in scientific plus philosophical principles, and therefore he felt that true philosophers were the ones that were able to understand natural laws that govern the world and society or man, you can say. So for him, education had to be based on two important steps. That is, education had to be grounded or rooted on empirical evidence. At the same time, there had to be logical reasoning. Okay, and this was as opposed to tradition or dogmas. Now, what happens when something is focused on traditions and dogmas? It limits creativity, it doesn't allow you to think out of the box. For example, the best example that we can give here is of the scribes and the Pharisees as opposed to the teachings of Jesus. Now, for example, when we look at Jesus, is considered to be a great teacher. Why? Because he understood the necessity or the context of the law. So rather than saying that this law has to be followed because it is written, because it is passed down from the centuries, he questioned whether it is really required, and he also showed why it is important or why it is needed. So therefore, Spencer also says that when we teach concepts, it is not only about rote learning, that is learning by heart, but also understanding the why, how, and the what. It is only when these things happen can education be successful, can education achieve its true goal. And for him, true education was understanding the principles of biology, psychology, and sociology. And this, he said, should be applied systematically to teaching. So in other words, we see that he advocated for subjects of natural sciences, in order to understand the world and the place where we live. Now coming to this, biology, psychology and sociology as indispensable for teaching and learning. So it's only when we first and foremost know about man, know about ourselves. Secondly, when we know the mindset, okay, of a particular person, and when we know the customs or the kind of traditions of that particular place, only then can this teaching be tailored for that particular place. Otherwise, it will be like taking a square like this and trying to fit in this circle. Okay, taking a big square trying to fit in a small circle. Rather than, it's only when we understand it, then things could be tailor-made to fit in a particular context or particular situation. So therefore, he said that the knowledge of natural science, particularly these three, were absolutely necessary. Only this would lead to a holistic understanding. So we see that education is in a way dependent on philosophy for the following reasons. First and foremost, we see philosophy determines the real destination. That means what we want to achieve. Okay, and we see that philosophy has also inspired theory and practice, and in a way it tries to give us the destination. Now for example, all of you are in the class, all of you are studying philosophy, okay, studying philosophy of nature, philosophy of God, moral philosophy, then Indian philosophy, etc. And therefore it's only when you know what is the real reason why you have to study it, only then can true education make sense. Otherwise, as we see, if it is done only for the sake, then it loses its meaning and purpose. And therefore this real destination has to be realized by the teachers, by the students, and also by the policy makers. By policy makers, I refer to those who are in charge of setting the curriculum, allotment of teaching hours, etc. So otherwise, if there is no proper time allocated for a particular subject, we see what will happen is enough time won't be given, and then it has to be rushed. As a result of it, learning is hampered. Next, we also see that it determines the various aspects of education. In a way, we see that education is a preparation for life. Whether it be the bachelor's degree, it be the master's or the doctorate, all prepare towards life, all prepare towards a particular life goal. And therefore, education should be a development of reason as well as other powers of the mind. And therefore, philosophy allows us to achieve this aim of education. Okay, we also see that every aspect of education will have a philosophical base. So as I said, everything, it be teachers, students, policymakers, are all in a way influenced and determined by philosophy. So as we saw in the earlier classes, it is philosophy that provides for the aims, methods, and the curriculum of education. Now, as we saw why education is dependent on philosophy, we also need to understand why philosophy is dependent on education. So first and foremost, we see that education is the dynamic side or the practical side of philosophy. And we can say that education is one of the strongest instrument to achieve the ideals of life and to attain a balanced development of human personality. So in a way we can say that if education is the plant, philosophy would be the soil that provides a kind of a nourishment, that provides the internal nutrients for education. And therefore there are philosophers who have also stated that education is an active dimension of philosophy and in a way essential to realize life goals. Next we see that education is the means to achieve the goal. Okay, the goal that is set based on the context, based on the times and situation. So we see that philosophy here will give the values and principles that are required in order for education to achieve the goal. So we see that Herbert Spencer had once said that education has no time to make holiday till all philosophical questions are once for all cleared up. That means education is complete in a way only when all aspects are taken care of. And therefore from our own life experience we will realize that everything cannot be taken care of, or we cannot achieve everything. That is why education or learning is an ongoing process. And finally we see that philosophy is dependent on education because of the functions of education in the present context. So it looks at the future or kind of forecasts the future and prepares for the future. And therefore the role of education is to, in a way, contribute to the efforts of man to achieve his particular goal. Therefore, it has to have it as its main function to build community and society. Okay, so this is why we see that three reasons why philosophy is dependent on education. And therefore now, after looking at this, it is important to look at how philosophy of teaching and the teaching styles are deeply interconnected. So we see that first and foremost, the beliefs of the teacher, the beliefs of the one who are responsible for education influence teaching as well as the teaching style. So as we already discussed, if there is not enough material or resources, if there is not enough time, that also will hamper the overall education. So therefore all these factors which may not seem important to us, indirectly we say influence the teaching as well as the teaching style. In a way, we see that whatever beliefs are held by the teacher will influence the strategies that they adopt in the class. Okay, and therefore, first and foremost, we need to kind of define what is philosophy of teaching. So as we said, it is basically the belief of the teacher as to how students can learn in the best possible manner. It is also the teacher's belief about the purpose of education, and most importantly, it is also about the nature of knowledge. So whatever the teacher's beliefs about how the students should learn, what is the purpose of the education, that will shape the teaching style as well as the philosophy behind the teaching of a particular subject. Next, we also see that these beliefs will shape various aspects. Now, what are these aspects? These could include decisions regarding the method of teaching or the methodology, the design of the curriculum, as well as the classroom management. Therefore, we see that those who are progressive will give more scope towards self-learning, will move out of the classroom with regard to their teaching styles. And as we will see later on also, how the difference between authoritarian and non-authoritarian teaching has an influence on the learning process of the student. Whereas we see that authoritarian tends to be teacher-centered and non-authoritarian stands to be student-centered. Okay, so this is how the belief of the teacher, belief of the ones who are responsible for education tend to influence various aspects of the teaching style and methodology. Now we see that there are certain questions or certain guiding questions which also help us to determine the philosophy of teaching. And what are these questions? First is, what is the nature of the learner? Or in other words, what is the nature of the student? Therefore we see that knowing the background of the student, knowing the nature of the student is very important. We see that all of us have different temperaments. Some are quick to learn, some take a longer time to learn. Some require everything to be given to them, whereas others learn better when they themselves have to discover this. So when the teacher knows what is the basic dynamic of the class, what the class is really interested in, or how the students are, it is only then can the curriculum or the teaching style be tailored to fit that particular aspect of teaching. Next is, what is the nature of the subject matter? Okay, what is the subject about? Is the subject practical or is it theoretical? Okay, so this will examine the structure, its relevance to the student's life. Is it relevant or is it not relevant? Is it relevant to society? So based on this nature of the subject, can the particular teaching style be tailored? Next question is, how should one use the subject matter to guide students towards meaningful learning activities? So this looks at how the content needs to be presented as well as explored. And how is it possible to actively engage students? So in other words, if it is a practical subject, if it includes time to be spent in the laboratory, etc., then automatically we see that the teacher's dimension or the teacher's outlook towards guiding the students will be different. If it is a theoretical subject, if it is a value-based subject, automatically the strategy will be different. And finally we see that what behavior trend should one exhibit to carry out this philosophical position. In other words, this will reflect the attitude and the interactions of the teacher with the students. Now we see that these questions are in a way important for the teacher to identify their teaching style, their teaching philosophy and the methodology that they will use for teaching. So first and foremost we see that these preferences, okay, that the teacher has, or the methods or the strategies based on these questions that we have just seen, these preferences are not rigid, but they tend to be influenced by the following philosophical perspectives or the different viewpoints which offer various ways to understanding reality and the world around. So we see that realism will have emphasis on structured and systematic teaching. It will base itself more on transmission of factual knowledge. That means a lot of facts, details, etc. On the other hand, we see that idealism will focus more on development of intellectual and moral values. And this can often be done through Socratic questioning. We'll come to this a little later when we look at how we are able to, in a way, extract the maximum out of the students. So, in this way, we see that Socratic questioning forcing the answer by means of questioning. So, asking one question, then based on the answer, going further by questioning till the student themselves realizes the answer. So, this, as we see, is another method or form of teaching as well. Pragmatism once again will focus on problem solving. That is real world application. So whether what is being taught, is it practical in the real world or is it just ideal? An idealistic thing that should be there but it is not possible to do in the real world. Existentialism focuses or gives priority to individual student choice and in a way it is more of a student centered approach. And therefore this is tailored or personalized based on the student. So as we said earlier, based on the nature of the student, so if the student is a slow learner, accordingly that particular section will be dealt in differently. If the students are fast learners, obviously there will be more activities given for them. So here we see that the teaching styles will be different for different individuals, for different students. Nothing will be kind of fixed or static. So next we see that behavior, trends and teaching styles. First and foremost, we see that the teaching styles should reflect the philosophical beliefs, and in this way it should also encourage student autonomy. So in this way we see that the teacher's behavior in the classroom, that is how they interact, how they manage, how they structure the activities. It should reflect their belief and their convictions. For example, a teacher who believes in student-centered learning will encourage collaborative learning. That means they will have more of group discussions, more of project work, etc., where the student themselves are given the resources, but they themselves have to reach towards the outcome, towards the goal. And next we see that teachers also should adapt based on the needs of the time. So therefore, when we look at dynamic and reflective practice of teachers or of their teaching styles, they should constantly adapt their teaching styles based on the situation. So the same way of presenting the class may not work every year. So therefore, you cannot have one kind of portion there and expect that you will teach the same portion in the same way for years to come. No, it has to change. First and foremost, you have to include new details plus facts. Therefore, when we are doing research, first and foremost, what we are told is to rely more on journals rather than books. If you are referring to books, there should be maximum 15 years back. Okay, so if you are writing some research in 2024, latest something that you can take is of 2013 or 2009 in that case. Because what happens is the world is developing, changes are taking place, different theories are being updated. So if there is no update being done, then we see that the teaching becomes irrelevant. Similarly, research also becomes irrelevant if it is not updated, because nobody wants information that has been outdated or that is not relevant for them any longer. Also, they need to constantly align with the educational values, what to achieve and how to achieve. So now we come to the nature of the learner, and first and foremost, understanding the nature of the student, understanding the various learning capacity, and there are two philosophical extreme positions over here. Okay, so both these we see the Lockean perspective and the Platonic perspectives are kind of extremes on the scale. So we see that the Lockean perspective would be a passive kind of a teaching approach, whereas Platonic would be more active, more student-based approach. And these perspectives, these two perspectives which we have, the Lockean perspective and the Platonic perspective, in a way will offer different views on how students acquire knowledge, at the same time it will also shape teaching styles and goals. So therefore, it is important for us to learn these two extremes so that when we are finalizing our policy, it can be somewhere in between which has a mix of both. As we did last time, we cannot stick to only one perspective. We need to have a mix and match and find a balance between the two. So let's take a look at the Lockean perspective, which is of course named after John Locke, and we find this perspective in his essay concerning human understanding. Okay, and therefore for him, the concept for this perspective is that the learner's mind is a tabula rasa. It's a blank state. So you don't have any knowledge, you have to add knowledge as you go along. So in other words, it is only when you fill a jar can you have some substance within it. Same thing with the mind. Now and therefore, based on this view of his, this perspective also has a similar process. So he says that knowledge is acquired only through sensory experiences. Through our senses, through what we see, through what we hear, through what we see, smell, taste, etc. And therefore it is this sensory data in a way makes impressions on our minds. That means when there is a particular object in front, whatever information that we get through our senses then is interpreted by our mind, and it is only after this interpretation that we are able to learn by absorbing the data, by processing data and co-relating it. It is only then can actual learning take place. And therefore he says that complex mental operations such as associations, interpretation and evaluation build on this sensory data in order to more advanced structures. So ultimately he says that however complicated a particular theory may be, or however complicated a process may be, ultimately it has to go back to our senses. It has to trace back to the data that we have received from the senses, and only then can we move ahead. So nothing is freely given, everything is a step-by-step process. And therefore we see that this perspective or this thought will influence teaching as well. And therefore teaching has to be a teacher-led instruction method, which means that teacher is the one only who is able to provide the best possible knowledge in the best possible way. So therefore, one of the main duty of the teacher is to transmit information, ensuring that the students receive and process data. In other words, the teacher's role is supposed to be more like a radio station transmitting sound waves, making sure that it is received by the student. And therefore we see that emphasis on rote learning, emphasis on studying by heart was basically influenced by this perspective. That means only this is what matters. You are not allowed to think, you are not allowed to question, you are not allowed to go beyond. And therefore repetitive practice, okay, repetition was said to be the key in order to solidify knowledge. Why? Because if it is not repeated, it will be wiped off or you will forget about it. Next, let us quickly just take a look at the Platonic perspective, which is the opposite of the Lockean perspective. This is more based on active learning. And this is based on the ideas of Plato, particularly his doctrine of reminiscence. Now, what is this doctrine of reminiscence? We'll take a look next time because we require a bit more time to look at this doctrine in detail. It's only when we understand this that the Platonic perspective will make sense to us. And he felt that learners already possess knowledge. So the basis of this perspective is that you already have knowledge within you. We only have to find ways of extracting it out. Okay, so next time we'll begin with the doctrine of reminiscence and then move forward to the other perspectives.